The morning of Lady Cecily Marlowe's wedding to Viscount Harwell, the great hall of Calder Hall was dressed in white narcissus and hothouse lilies, so thick their perfume gathered against the ceiling like fog. Every family of consequence in 3 counties had come to witness it. The tables ran the full length of the room. The silver caught the winter light through windows that had been cleaned for the occasion, every pane of them, and the guests arrived in colors that announced their certainty. They belonged here, and everyone else could be identified by the plainness of their dress and the direction of their gaze. Georgiana stood at the far end of the room, her gray wool gown pressed smooth, her dark hair pinned without ornament, her hands folded at her waist. She was not waiting to be seated. She was watching a child of 9 years old who had pressed her nose against the cold window glass and was tracing the frost with one finger, and she was deciding how long she could hold the room's attention at nothing before something landed on her that she could not walk away from. Something landed. Lady Dorothea Calder, the Earl of Ashwell's aunt, crossed the room with the particular velocity of a woman who had decided that a problem required solving before the fish course. She was 60 years old, jeweled at the throat and wrist, and she spoke in the middle register that carried to surrounding tables without appearing to reach them. "A servant and nothing more," Dorothea said, addressing not George, but a woman beside her whose name George did not yet know. "Brought to a family wedding, as though she were a guest. My nephew has always lacked the instinct for appropriate occasion." George kept her eyes on Agnes. Agnes pulled her finger from the glass and turned around, and for a moment, looking at the girl's clear face, George understood what the morning would require of her. She had known since the carriage ride from London, possibly since the first night she had read Agnes to sleep in the narrow room on Half Moon Street, that arriving at Calder Hall would cost something. She had not known until this moment precisely what. The season had opened 6 weeks earlier, in the second week of October, and George had been hired to attend to Agnes on the recommendation of a mutual acquaintance of her father's. Her father, Dmitri Ivanov, had come to Bath from St. Petersburg 30 years before, a merchant dealing in cloth and amber who had married an English vicar's daughter and produced 1 child before the money ran thin, and the cold found him. George had grown up reading in 3 languages and wearing dresses let out at the seam, and she had learned early that the most useful quality a woman in her position could possess was the ability to be invisible in rooms that required it and present in the ones that did not. Edmund Calder, the Earl of Ashwell, had interviewed her for the position of Agnes's attendant in a study lined with law books and precisely ordered correspondence, and he had asked 3 questions: whether she could manage a child who did not sleep easily, whether she could manage a season in London without requiring management herself, whether she had any prior claim on her time that might interrupt the arrangement. She had answered all 3 without embellishment, and he had hired her at a wage of 14 shillings a week, which was a fair wage for a lady's attendant, and she had accepted it as such. She had not, in those first days, thought much of what the Earl looked like. He was 34 years old, square-shouldered, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a quality of stillness about him that she recognized as the stillness of a man who had learned to hold himself at some remove from rooms he found difficult. His jaw carried the faint tension of a decision maintained. His eyes were a pale gray that in candlelight looked almost colorless, and he issued instructions in short declarative sentences that conveyed authority without apparent effort. He did not ask whether the instructions suited her. She did not expect him to. Agnes had taken to her within the first afternoon. The child was quick and curious and suffered from a recurring fear that visited her at night, a thin trembling that was not quite crying and not quite silence, and George had discovered that the thing which soothed it was not reassurance, but reading aloud in a steady voice with the candle left burning. She had read to Agnes from a collection of natural history essays her father had left behind, and from a volume of Mr. Cowper's verse, and once from a letter Edmund had written to Agnes during a brief absence, which Agnes had insisted upon because she said George's reading voice made even ordinary things sound as though they mattered. George had read that letter without inflection, and without letting any of its content arrive in her face, and she had set it down when she was done, and asked Agnes what she would like to do next. And Agnes had said she would like to hear it again. So she had read it again. Lady Dorothea had appeared at the Half Moon Street house in the third week of the season, on a Tuesday afternoon when Edmund was at his club. She had come, ostensibly, to visit Agnes, but she had stayed when Agnes left the room to fetch her embroidery, and she had set £20 on the tea table in 2 folded notes, and she had said, in the same carrying middle register, that a sensible woman would find it useful to know whether her niece's ward was forming any undesirable attachments or expressing any undesirable opinions about the family arrangements. George had looked at the money for a moment. £20 was several weeks' wages. £20 would have bought her the coat she had been walking past in the window of a shop on Piccadilly since the first frost. She had pushed the notes back across the table. Dorothea had not moved immediately. Something shifted behind her eyes, a calculation recalculated, and then she had picked up the notes and tucked them away and said pleasantly that she hoped George would find the season agreeable, and had left. George had understood, watching the carriage pull away from the window, that she had made an enemy of the woman without raising her voice or altering her expression, and that the enemy would remember it at a time of her choosing. The invitation to Cecily's wedding had arrived at the Half Moon Street house 2 weeks before the ceremony, addressed to the Earl of Ashwell and his party. Edmund had stood in the study, holding it for longer than he usually held correspondence, long enough for George, passing with Agnes's lesson books, to notice the particular quality of the pause. Cecily Marlowe had been engaged to Edmund 3 years ago. The engagement had ended. George did not know the terms of the ending, and had not sought to learn them. What she knew was that the invitation named Calder Hall, which was Edmund's family estate, and had been lent to Mr. Finch, the bride's father, for the occasion, as was sometimes done between families of old acquaintance, and that attending it would require Edmund to stand in his own rooms while another man was given a woman he had once expected to marry. He had told George the following morning that Agnes would accompany him, that a family occasion was proper instruction for a child of 9, and that he expected George to attend as Agnes's companion. She had said yes, and had gone to press Agnes's white muslin, and had not asked anything else. The road to Wiltshire took the better part of 2 days. Agnes slept against George's shoulder for the second half of the second day, and Edmund sat across from them in the carriage reading documents, or appearing to read documents, which George recognized as a different thing because she had noticed that when he was truly reading, his left thumb moved at the edge of the page in small, regular intervals, as though counting lines, and for the last hour of the journey, his thumb was still. He was watching something outside the window, or watching something inside his own consideration, and his face had the quality of winter stone, present, unmarked, giving nothing. He had said, without looking away from the window, "Agnes does well with you." George had said, "She is a good student." He had said nothing further. The thumb moved once, then stopped. They had arrived at Calder Hall in the evening of the second day, when the drive was lit with lanterns that had been placed by the groundskeepers along the gravel, and the house had risen from the dark with the particular gravity of stone that has stood long enough to have opinions. Agnes had pressed her face to the carriage window and said it looked like a castle, and Edmund had said it was older than most castles and far colder, and Agnes had laughed, which was a sound that George had come to notice, because it happened more freely than it once had, and because Edmund's expression, on hearing it, underwent a shift so slight she might have missed it if she had not been watching. The shift was not happiness exactly. It was something nearer to a man who had expected a door to remain closed and found it had opened a degree. She catalogued that shift and filed it with the others and said nothing. The morning before the wedding, Calder Hall's kitchen maid, a girl of perhaps 17 named Nell, had fallen ill with a fever in the night. The household physician had been sent for and was expected from Salisbury by 9 in the morning, and the girl had been settled on a cot in the linen room off the kitchen passage, alone, because the other kitchen staff were required upstairs for the wedding preparations and could not spare the time. George had risen at 5:30, as she always did, and had dressed Agnes and seen her to breakfast, and then, on her way back through the corridor, had heard the sound from the linen room. Not crying, but a thin, quiet wakefulness that she recognized from Agnes's nights. She had opened the door. She had sat down on the stool beside the cot. She had picked up the small volume of Cowper's verse that she carried in her apron pocket, as she had carried it since Agnes had first requested it, and she had begun to read. She was on the third poem when she heard, from the doorway, a sound she could not immediately identify. A footstep on flagstone, then nothing. She did not turn. She read the last 2 stanzas through to their end, closed the book, told Nell that the physician would arrive before 10, and that the fever would be less by evening. Nell had said, in a voice thin with gratitude, that she was very kind. George had said she was not kind. She had simply been awake. And she had left. Edmund was not in the corridor when she stepped out. She had thought, briefly, that she had imagined the footstep, and had gone upstairs to see that Agnes's white muslin had not creased in the night. She had imagined nothing. He had been standing 4 feet inside the corridor, close enough to hear every word of the reading, and he had stood there for the better part of 20 minutes without moving, and she never knew it. What she knew, if she had been cataloguing carefully enough, was that his instructions to her over the next several hours were shorter, even than usual, and that when he guided Agnes through the formal introduction to the arriving guests, his hand was held, not at his side, but at a small, deliberate remove that seemed to cost him something to maintain. She did not catalogue it correctly. She read it as employer's gravity. It was not. The night before the ceremony, George found Agnes unable to sleep, which was not unusual, and read to her until the candle burned low, and then sat in the dim room after Agnes's breathing had steadied, and let herself, for a few minutes, think. She thought about Nell in the linen room. She thought about the carriage ride and the still thumb. She thought about the way Edmund had said Agnes does well with you, and the weight, or absence of weight, in those 4 words. And she decided that she was constructing a meaning where the plain words contained none. A man of his rank, in a house full of people who had known him since his birth, returning to a place where the woman he had once intended to marry was now marrying another man, had no space in his attention for a lady's attendant who read poetry to sick kitchen maids. She was a servant, and nothing more, as Dorothea had said, and the phrase sat in her chest that night like a coin she had found, and could not spend. If you have been watching George's story from the beginning, you may already understand what she could not yet see. Leave a word in the comments about a woman who persisted with quiet dignity, and carry on with her. Edmund's wound had surfaced 2 days before the ceremony, in the late afternoon, when he and Agnes were in the library, and George was at the writing table near the window, working through a schedule for the following morning. She had not been meant to overhear it. The library was large enough that her corner was, functionally, private, and when Edmund began speaking to Agnes in the lower register he reserved for serious things, She had stilled herself and made no sign that she was present. Agnes had asked, as she sometimes did in the evenings, about her mother. Edmund had been quiet for long enough that George thought he would not answer. Then he said, in the level voice of a man who has rehearsed an explanation so many times it has worn smooth, "She was very good. She was better than the arrangement she was given." Agnes had asked what that meant. He had said, without flourish, that when Agnes was being born, he had been advised to send for a physician from London, and he had delayed the decision by 2 days because there was business in Parliament that he had believed he could not leave, and by the time the physician arrived from London, there was nothing to be done. Agnes's mother had died 6 years ago, 3 days after Agnes herself was born, and Edmund had carried the arithmetic of those 2 days without putting it down. Agnes had said, in the clear, practical voice of a child who has had time to absorb a grief, "You could not have known." He had said, "I knew." George had kept her eyes on the schedule in front of her, and had not moved, and had understood at the level below thought the source of the coldness. It was not coldness. It was a man standing at a permanent remove from his own judgment, maintaining the distance as a form of discipline, because to close it would require forgiving something he did not believe he had earned the right to forgive. She had turned one page of the schedule without reading it, and had felt the small, plain ache of comprehension settle in her. She was present enough to notice, and constrained enough to have no right to say so. The morning of the ceremony arrived gray and cold, with a sky that promised snow before evening. Calder Hall filled by 10:30 with the guests from the surrounding county, and George dressed Agnes in the white muslin and the dark blue sash, and pinned Agnes's hair back with a narrow ribbon, and Agnes endured all of it with the patient gravity of a child who has been told that ceremony is a form of respect. The ceremony itself was in the family chapel at the east end of the house, and George stood at the back with Agnes, watching Cecily Marlowe proceed down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, with a train held by 2 smaller cousins. Cecily was 24, fair, composed, the sort of woman who moved through rooms as though the rooms had been arranged in anticipation of her passage. She paused at the front and took the arm of Viscount Harwell, who was 40, and amiable and clearly relieved, and the vicar began. George watched Edmund from the back. He stood in the 3rd pew, exactly upright, his face the carved stone profile she had learned to read for the faint signals underneath. He did not look at Cecily for the first portion of the ceremony. He looked at the altar window, where the winter light came through clear glass rather than colored, which meant it arrived as plain illumination, without ceremony of its own. Then he looked, once at Cecily, and looked away. And what George read in that single glance was not grief and not longing, but something nearer to the act of closing a specific drawer and ensuring it was shut. She felt, against her judgment, a small pulse of something she had no appropriate name for. Agnes slipped her hand into George's. George held it. At the wedding breakfast that followed in the great hall, the tables were arranged in a horseshoe, with the bridal couple at the top, and the guests arrayed outward in the acknowledged hierarchy of rank and connection. George was seated at the far end of the outer table, at the position reserved for attendants and companions, which was accurate and expected. Agnes sat beside her because Agnes had refused to sit elsewhere, which produced a brief procedural difficulty that was resolved when Mr. Finch, the bride's father, waved a hand and said that children might sit where they liked. Mr. Finch was a baronet of moderate wealth and considerable social confidence, and his tolerance for Agnes was the tolerance of a man who had accomplished his primary objective and could afford magnanimity. Lady Dorothea was seated 3 places up the inner table, in a position that gave her a clear view of the outer end, and she had been watching George with a quality of attention that George had learned, over the past 6 weeks, to identify precisely. It was the attention of a woman who had made a decision and was waiting for the correct moment to implement it. The moment came during the second course. A woman to Dorothea's left, whose name George would later learn was Mrs. Pennington, made some remark about the composition of the party, glancing toward the outer table in a way that was polite enough to permit misreading and deliberate enough to prevent it. Dorothea said, in her carrying middle register, that the Earl of Ashwell had brought a servant to a family occasion, which was a novel interpretation of the word party. The table nearest them went quiet. Agnes's hand tightened on her fork. George said to Agnes, very quietly, "Eat your soup." The third voicing came 20 minutes later, without the softening of distance. Dorothea had risen, which was notable, and had crossed to the outer table with a sheet of paper folded once, held in her gloved hand with the particular formality of a woman presenting evidence rather than delivering a social call. "I have," Dorothea said, addressing the surrounding table, rather than George directly. "A letter. It was brought to my attention this morning from a friend in London, and I think those present ought to understand the character of the persons my nephew chooses to bring into a family celebration." She set the folded paper on the tablecloth. "This woman applied for a paid position with the household of Lord Crewe's estate at the end of last month. The letter is in her own hand. She was seeking a better situation. She is in this room under false pretenses, as a servant and nothing more, and my nephew has been deceived into thinking otherwise." The table was fully silent. Mr. Finch, at the top, had turned in his chair. Cecily Marlowe Harwell had gone very still in a different way, the stillness of a woman reassessing the composition of a scene she thought she understood. Agnes had put down her fork. George looked at the letter. She recognized the paper, which was her own, and the date, which was correct. And she understood in the space of 2 seconds what the letter was, and what it was not. She had written to Lord Crewe's housekeeper, yes, in the last week of October, because she had, at that point, had no assurance that Edmund's invitation would extend beyond the season, and a woman in her position did not wait to see whether the ground would hold before identifying alternative ground. The letter was not deception. It was prudence, of the kind that everyone in the room with a salary and no capital understood perfectly well. She could have explained all of this in several sentences. She chose one. She stood up. The room was quiet enough that her chair's movement on the floor was audible. She said, clearly, without heat, "I wrote to Lord Crewe's housekeeper because I did not know whether I would still have employment after Christmas. That is the whole of the letter's content, and anyone who reads it may confirm the fact." She sat down. The room held its breath, Dorothea's chin lifted by a degree. She opened her mouth. Edmund set down his glass. He had been at the near end of the inner table, and he rose in the same movement, the kind of rising that does not announce itself and requires no pause, and he walked the length of the room with a pace that was not hurried and was not slow, and the guests on either side turned their heads as he passed, because the quality of his movement demanded it, the way weather demands attention before it arrives. He stopped beside George. He did not look at Dorothea. He looked at George, and his pale gray eyes held the specific quality she had noticed in the carriage on the road to Wiltshire, the quality of a man who has stopped maintaining a distance he had maintained for 6 years, and for whom the stopping is both a relief and a cost he is prepared to meet. He said to the room and to her, "Miss Ivanov is not here as a servant." His voice was level. the short declarative register that derived its authority from the weight behind it, rather than from volume. She is here because I asked her to come. The distinction is mine to make, and I have made it. Dorothea's fan stopped moving. Mr. Finch said nothing. Cecily, at the top of the table, looked at George for a long moment, with the expression of a woman who is reassessing a calculation she had thought was settled. And then she looked at her new husband, and something in her face composed itself into the specific resolution of a woman choosing not to contest a scene she has decided is not worth the cost. Edmund offered George his hand, not his arm, as a host assists a guest, his hand, open and direct, as a statement of fact rather than of ceremony. George looked at his hand. She was aware of the entire room watching her. She was aware of Agnes, who had gone very still with the stillness of a child who is hoping something will happen, and is afraid to believe it is happening. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was not rapid but was fully present, audible in the way that a clock becomes audible when a room goes quiet. She placed her hand in his. The room exhaled. Dorothea sat down. She did it in the particular manner of a woman who is recalibrating her position rather than conceding it. But she sat, which was sufficient for the moment. And her expression held, for the first and only time that George had observed it, a shade of something that was not quite shame and not quite recognition, but occupied the territory between them. She did not speak again for the remainder of the wedding breakfast. Agnes picked up her fork. The remainder of that afternoon, George did not afterwards reconstruct in sequence. There were things she was certain of, that Edmund remained at her side through the toast and the concluding formalities, that he spoke to Mr. Finch with the particular brevity of a man settling something without discussion, that the guests who had been nearest to the outer table found occasions to address her with the careful courtesy of people revising a position they had not spoken aloud. She was certain that Cecily departed for the carriage with her new husband without approaching the outer table, which was both relief and information. She was certain that Agnes, released from ceremony, found her within the hour and reported in a satisfied voice that Mrs. Pennington had told her Ward was very fortunate to have such a good companion. What George was less certain of was the walk in the east garden that she took in the late afternoon, when the sky had turned the color of pewter and the first snow was beginning, not falling heavily, but arriving as a considered intention. Edmund had come to the garden by a different path, and had found her at the low stone wall that looked south toward the wood, and they had stood together for a time without a specific reason that either of them articulated. He said eventually, "I should have made that clear before this morning." She said, "You made it clear when it was needed." He said in the register he used for things that cost him something, "That is a more generous reading than I have earned." She considered the question of whether to say the plain thing. She had been careful, throughout the season, not to say plain things about matters that exceeded her position. She had refused a bribe and read poetry to a sick girl and held a 9-year-old's hand through a ceremony that was not hers to attend, and she had done all of it without requiring anything in return or naming what it was that she was doing. She had not named the watching. She had not named the carriage ride, or the letters Edmund sent Agnes, or the 2 days he had not sent for the physician, or the way the library lamp had been burning when she reached the passage at 11 o'clock every night as she passed. She said, "Your ward told me you light the library lamp when you cannot sleep." He said nothing. She said, "You have not slept easily in 6 years." He turned to look at her then. His face held the quality of a man who has been accurately perceived and is deciding what to do with the accuracy. She said, "You are not the only person in this house who has been managing the question of where to go next." The snow was falling more steadily now, small and precise against her cheek, and the light was dropping toward the long blue of a winter evening. The stone wall was cold beneath her hands. Edmund reached into his coat. She recognized the motion, because she had seen it twice before. Once in the carriage, when he had put something away with a deliberateness that belonged to reflex rather than thought. And once in the study at Half Moon Street, when he had checked his pocket before going out. A small private verification of an object's presence. He took out a folded letter. Not the letter Dorothea had produced at breakfast, which had been a calculated weapon. This was older paper, worn at the fold, written in a different hand than his own. He said, "This was the physician's assessment, written 6 years ago. I have carried it since." He paused. "I have read it a great number of times, and it has never said what I hoped it would say. Agnes's mother was unwell before I delayed the decision. The physician's opinion was that the outcome may not have differed. I have not been able to use that information for very long." He held the letter out to her. She looked at it. She understood what the act was. A man who had carried the arithmetic of 2 days for 6 years, who had arranged his life around the maintenance of a precise and punishing distance, was putting the arithmetic into her hands instead. Not to absolve himself, to stop carrying it alone. She took the letter. He said, with the particular formality of a man making a statement that will have procedural consequences, "I would like you to remain at Ashwell Park, in a capacity rather different from the one we agreed in October." She said, "I will require some precision as to the new capacity." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the smallest motion, a degree from nothing, and she recognized it because Agnes had described it once. Her guardian smiled once in a blue moon, she had said, and when he did, it was like finding a window in a wall you had thought was solid. He said, "I am asking you to be my wife, Miss Ivanov. I thought precision was warranted." The snow fell between them, even and fine. She said, "Then yes." She would think later about the simplicity of that word. The months of holding herself precisely at the correct professional distance, the catalogue of signals she had misread and then slowly, carefully read correctly, the bribe she had refused and the morning she had spent reading Cowper to a sick kitchen maid who deserved someone to sit with her, and the carriage rides and the library lamp and the 9-year-old who slept more easily now than she had 6 weeks ago. All of it arrived, in the moment of that single syllable, at its plain destination. She had not expected to be chosen. She had expected to endure. The endurance, it turned out, had been witness to itself all along. By the Christmas season, Calder Hall had been returned to the family, and the Earl and his new wife had taken up residence at Ashwell Park, which was in Derbyshire and somewhat larger than Calder Hall, and had a great deal of cold corridor between the library and the morning room, which Agnes considered a personal asset because it was excellent for running. George had spent the weeks between the engagement and the marriage understanding the house in the methodical way she understood things, by walking it at different hours and in different light, learning which rooms held warmth and which required it, finding the places where the windows let in the view across the park toward the wood, where the snow was still on the ground in December and lay along the upper branches of the elms with the precision of something arranged. The wedding itself was held quietly at the parish church in the village below the park, with Agnes as the single attendant and a handful of Edmund's closest acquaintance as witnesses. There were no hothouse lilies. There was cold winter light through plain glass, which George found she preferred, and the vicar was elderly and precise, and read the ceremony with the straightforward dignity of a man who had conducted it many times and had not grown tired of its weight. Lady Dorothea attended. She sat in the second pew with her back very straight and her fan in her lap, still for once, and she did not speak at the reception afterward except to tell George, in a private moment beside the window, that she hoped the match would prove a steadying influence. It was not an apology. It was the closest thing to one that the architecture of the woman's pride permitted, and George received it with the same quiet she had brought to the refusal of the 20 pounds, which was to say without triumph and without resentment, accepting it for what it was. Edmund observed this exchange from across the room. She knew, without looking, that he was watching it, because she had learned to track the quality of his attention by a combination of small, reliable signals: the set of his shoulders when his gaze had a specific object, the stillness of the thumb at the edge of a page. His thumb was still. Agnes found her, after the last guest had gone, when the house was settling into the particular quiet of a winter evening after a day of ceremony, and the fire in the morning room had been built up, and the candles were lit, and there was nothing required of anyone. Agnes had changed out of the white muslin and into her everyday wool, and was carrying the small volume of Cowper's verse, which she had taken from George's room at some point during the day as a proprietary act. She sat down at the piano in the corner of the room. George had taught her a piece over the course of the season, a simple arrangement in G major that Agnes had taken to with the same precise application she brought to her natural history lessons, playing it phrase by phrase until she had it, and then playing it from beginning to end with the careful concentration of a child who understands that continuity matters. She had not played it perfectly in October. She played it now with the ease of something that had had time to become familiar. The notes moved through the room, measured and clear, and the snow outside the morning room window fell the same as it had in the east garden at Calder Hall, small and deliberate, settling on the park's winter grass with a quiet that asked nothing of anyone. Edmund was at the writing table. He had taken out a sheet of paper and set it before him. But he was not writing. He was listening to Agnes play. George stood near the fire, the physician's letter held loosely in her hand. She had not returned it to him after the garden. He had not asked for it. It had lived in her apron pocket in the weeks since, a quiet weight, and now she turned it once and set it on the mantelpiece, in the particular position of something that no longer needed to be carried, but should not be lost. He looked up from the writing table when she set it down. He looked at the mantelpiece, then at her. She said nothing. She said she did not need to. Agnes reached the end of the piece and held the final chord a moment longer than the notation required, the way she had been doing since November, as though testing the room's willingness to let the sound continue. The room was willing. The snow fell on Ashwell Park, quiet and even, on the glass of windows that were hers now, and the fire held its warmth. And the Earl of Ashwell looked at his wife across a room that had stopped requiring them to keep their distance, and Agnes played the last phrase again, from the beginning, because she could. If George's story found its way to you this evening, leave a word in the comments about her. She would appreciate the company, and so would we.